Well then, folks, welcome back to the Inside Line F1 podcast. Welcome back to the Miami GP race review. Welcome back to the Miami GP coverage on the Inside Line F1 podcast, I must say. And I love it, right? We started the week with a great voice of Formula One, the voice that I used to hear back in the day in the Formula E broadcast with Bob Varsha. And we end the week with the voice that I actually started listening to when I watched Formula One in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Steve Slater, the voice of Formula One's coverage back in Asia with Fox Sports and Star Sports back in the day, here with us for this review. And there's a lot of things we have to discuss about Red Bull, about how good they are, did they finally have the best car, about Leclerc, Perez, so much stuff. And also, did this race actually deliver the hype that we all thought it would? So all of that and more on this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. Welcome back in, folks. Welcome back to this episode. Firstly, my name is Samuel Arora. I'm the host of The Driving Force on Disney Plus Hotstar, joined by Kunal Shah, the former marketing head of the Force India F1 team. And the third guest, as we mentioned, is Mr. Steve Slater. But sir, I'll start with you. Firstly, I still have to pinch myself sometime to remind that we are actually able to do this with you on a Monday afternoon. But firstly, how are you doing? And the big question that I've got for you is, did this weekend live up to the hype that you thought it would?
I think it probably did. I mean, anyone who saw the chaotic grid walkabout where the drivers couldn't even get to the cars for the Hollywood A-listers, B-listers and wannabes, I think it was great fun. It's got me really thinking about how on earth you're going to do it better than that in Las Vegas if the Americans want to do the American hype. There were certain things on it that did jar with me that was so artificial and so fake that just made you laugh, like the marina where they trucked in and craned in 7 or 8 big expensive yachts and put them in a puddle in a car park. I mean, that was a bit cheesy. But equally, there are other things I thought were brilliant. The beach club idea. Can you imagine going to a Formula One race, being able to sit on a sandy beach and better still go and swim in one of 4 swimming pools while you're watching the race? How cool is that?
Superb, isn't it?
It makes you smile. And at the end of the day, Formula One is fun, it's entertainment, it's a great racing series and a great sport, but it should make you smile as well. And Miami did that in spades.
It absolutely did, and I loved the whole atmosphere and the build-up. And I was when I was watching the build-up, for once I was like, I have never seen so many people on the start grid ever in my life before. And I put out a tweet saying, are they going to be able to clear the grid in time for the race?
Yes, herding Hollywood A-listers. It's a new sport.
I mean, you've got a feel for Martin Brundle, right? If you've seen the clips of that post-race, pre-race grid walk, you kind of get an idea of how big of a challenge that was. But in terms of the event overall, sir, we've got, again, as you mentioned, the beach club, we've got the fake marina. The circuit looked exciting, but in general, if you had to rate the event, what would you give it? For me, I think it was a solid 8 in a way. I think the race was better than I thought it would, because with the surface issues, with the passing as well, it felt like an old school 80s Formula One race where passing was hard and you had to earn your moves all the way through. Would you share the same opinion per se?
I would go for an 8. I think it's an 8, largely down thanks to Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly, because if they hadn't had their incident and brought out the safety car, and let's face it, on that circuit, which is basically a 320 kilometre an hour street circuit, I mean, that's mad in itself. No runoff areas. If you get it wrong, you're going to hit something solid. Lando did an amazing job of keeping his car out of the wall after the 2 cars had made contact. But that bringing out the safety car closed that race up. Otherwise, it would have been, I think it was the term I used to use, a drone fest. It would have easily been, it could easily have slipped to being a 6 or a 7 out of 10 had it not been for that safety car near the end. When it did, though, and it closed the field back up, I think it just showed the 2 class drivers in the current Formula One field giving it their absolute best. And those last 15 laps of the race, I would give that a 9 out of 10.
Wow, you both are very generous with your ratings, I must say that. I was probably like on the lower spectrum of the scale, but I'm probably embarrassed to rate it myself. Maybe my expectations were extremely high, but I have a stat which I'd love to share since we spoke about the safety car. The safety car has actually made an appearance in every race of 2022. And of course, Nicolas Latifi would be happy that he wasn't the one who triggered the safety car this race in Miami.
More the Williams team accountants, I think.
Oh, seriously. I mean, they've been having an absolutely torrid time, but I think there's one really fun thing to pick up on because, sir, your rating for the race was 8, and interestingly enough, it kind of brings us very smoothly onto a segment that we've just started on the Inside Line F1 podcast, which is the 8th sleep performer of the race. For me personally, I just can't look beyond Max Verstappen and the way he drove, but what would it be for you, sir? I suppose it's hard to look beyond him as well because there's barely any prep time that he had in practice, and to do what he did in the race as well, that's just phenomenal stuff.
I think actually I would go along with you, but I would actually say it was equal between him and Charles Leclerc. They were both well ahead of anybody else in the field. There was probably a lot of effort going on elsewhere in that field, though. Behind Sainz and Perez, you had Russell charging up from 12th. His tyres and everything worked a little bit better in the circumstances. Those early laps must have been torrid for George Russell on completely unusable hard tyres. It took them forever to get up to temperature. I think it was about 16 laps. That's when other people were thinking about the first pit stop. His tyres were just starting to work at that point. So it was a really difficult race for a lot of people. The other guy, I thought, it's such a tragedy that Mick Schumacher didn't get a championship point for his efforts. He was out driving the car. You've got Kevin Magnussen, who I rate as one of the best drivers in Formula One without a good car under him. And there you had Mick Schumacher actually outperforming Kevin Magnussen. So that was an amazing performance. Just sadly, his collision with Sebastian Vettel meant that he wasn't going to wind up in the points.
Again, I think I've just gotten off from the different side of the bed or something because... But I'll take cue from what you said, Steve. George Russell, he was my 8th sleep performer of the race. And I just adding to what you're saying, the opening laps would have been so miserable. He was, he said he was down to P16 all the way. And then he actually drove a very Lewis Hamilton-esque race, I would say. He was calling his own strategy. He said, let's wait it out till a VSC or a safety car appears. Made that move when it actually came. Stroke of luck. Suddenly finds himself, charging Lewis Hamilton for position. They also battled on track. And then, finishing in the top 5. And he's the only driver to have had a top 5 finish in all 5 races this season. And I think that is fantastic, given all the struggles Mercedes has been having, most specifically even with the likes of Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And let's face it, the 4 guys that were in front of him were riding racehorses. He was riding a donkey. That car is. There is no other way you can describe that car as horrible. Even when it's going well, it's horrible. It's a knife edge performance. The moment you get 1%, even 0.1% over the limit with that car, it's gone. It's not trying to help you at all. And that, for Lewis Hamilton to be struggling with a car like that, it just shows how bad it is. And that's indicative of a real problem that Mercedes have, I think, in that they've never been in this situation in recent times. Most of the people who are working in Mercedes GP now have only ever run with a front-running car. They've never had to basically to sort out a dog. And this is the one problem that Mercedes is going to have. Interesting, we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about Red Bull shortly, because I think that's one of the key reasons they have an advantage here is that Adrian Newey came from the days of the old ground effect cars. His first cars were ground effect racing cars. He knows how to design one. There's no one Mercedes that does.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that Mercedes just don't have the experience to do that because they're in this weird circumstance, and we all have the confidence that, well, it's Mercedes. They've got the technical know-how. They've got the prowess. But again, it's a specific problem that we're looking at. And so it seems like improvements are there, but are they really there? Are Mercedes actually on the way up? Because this weekend, it was positive for sure, but it's hard to quantify where they really are in the position order.
Well, they've also got to be a little bit careful because there is the budget cap. And there's a cap on the amount of time you can spend in the wind tunnel, and they have the least, of course, with Red Bull by having been at the top of the championship last year. So they've got to ration some of their development time, and that's going to have an impact potentially on the 23 car as well. But it's a really interesting challenge. These cars are fundamentally different to the cars we saw in 2021. They get their downforce from a different way. The power units are quite fundamentally different. The car is heavier, yet it's more compact. It really is a really big challenge, and Mercedes have never really had to fight that sort of a challenge in the past.
They haven't, and even the likes of, I would say, Lewis Hamilton, his radio call where the team was asking him about, whether he wanted to pit under the safety car, and the whole blow-up that's happened in the media after that is a little surprising because, up until now, he was always seen to be the driver who would overrule his team's strategic decisions in a race. Yeah. And suddenly this time he just turned around and said, hey, you guys have all the information. You tell me what to do. Although I suspect maybe the team was just expecting some feedback on the tires and whether he wanted to switch to the softs at some point, because that's what I remember hearing McLaren and Daniel Ricciardo do. So maybe, it will get clarified, but just surprising to see Hamilton, go through these tough moments with Mercedes.
Well, I think Lewis has always been a little bit like that. He will give 100% every inch of the way, but if he's being asked dumb questions, he'll tell you it's a dumb question. And I think that it was a demonstration to me of a certain lack of maturity on the Mercedes pit wall. Don't forget, they've lost gurus like, first of all, Ross Brawn, of course, who was really the founder of that team. And then they lost James Allison, although he's still there in an administrative role in the headquarters in Brackley in England. James is now no longer on the pit wall. There's no longer that calm, tactical voice. And I'm even seeing Toto Wolff just getting frustrated, losing the plot a little bit. So maybe they also had that real disappointment at the end of the last season. That may well also still have affected some of the morale within that team. It's going to be interesting to see how they fight back. Now we're getting onto what I would call Mercedes home ground, places like Barcelona.
You know what? I think the fact that Bottas could have potentially finished ahead of them just rubs it in a little bit more. Because here's a driver that was with them. They dropped them, and suddenly Valtteri Bottas is out qualifying the Mercedes. He's doing a great job to keep up with them. It's interesting how things are playing out in that sense. But if anything, I just think it goes to show that Red Bull have done an even more greater job, because to be in a championship fight and to still have a competitive car next year, I think it's quite something. So this actually brings me on to discuss Red Bull in a way, because now this weekend we saw that Red Bull, well, they were comprehensively pretty fast, right? They've got this amazing straight line speed package. They were great last time up whenever we had cool temperatures. This time it was hotter. Red Bull still had the advantage. They weren't able to manage degradation. Have they just created a better car all out, sir? And I mean, we thought that Ferrari were the favourites, but they've suddenly just clawed back in.
I think there are two answers to your question there. I think the first one is, if you go back to fundamentals, Red Bull are the only team with an active designer in Adrian Newey that has past experience of the problems of running a Venturi tunnel race car. Adrian designed the Leighton House cars, and those were among the very first Venturi ground effect F1 cars that got the majority of their suction onto the track from under the body of the car. You could almost take the wings off a Leighton House and it would still go around the corners. Whereas the majority of the designers now, one or two minor exceptions, have come from a background of using big wings, lots of downforce, and actually making the car just very, very quick through the massive amounts of downforce they were generating. You've got entire aerodynamic departments, over 100 people sitting in front of computers at places like Mercedes, and they have never experienced this porpoising effect, which is a specific characteristic to Formula cars that use a Venturi and use ground effect. And in fact, it's even been around in things like Sport 2000 cars and Formula 4 cars in club racing. These cars that use this, you get that porpoising effect. If you're lucky, you're able to drive through it. It's clear that in certain cases you're not here, and Mercedes are spending a huge amount of effort trying to spill air progressively from underneath the car, spill suction progressively from underneath the car to avoid that. In fact, it was very interesting to notice Ferrari had a mechanism for doing it by actually making a smaller rear diffuser to allow the air to spill around it. And that's actually reduced the porpoising. But what they've done at Ferrari is actually minimize the problem. What Adrian Newey did from the outset is he seemed to understand what was going on with the airflow under the car, and he managed it. And that has given Red Bull a definite advantage. And their ability to run with less wing more straight line speed. Okay, giving up a little bit of downforce in the medium speed corners is absolutely down to Adrian Newey and the car design. And they probably have the best car on the block at the moment, although Ferrari are running them ever so close.
Yeah, it makes me ask the question, is Red Bull Racing, do they have the fastest car suddenly, fifth race of the season? Because when we started the season, it was like, oh my god, Ferrari's come up with a magical machine and this is going to be Ferrari's championship winning year, etc., etc. But my reading, and I'd love to hear what you think, is there are finer margins, there are track characteristics at play, and then of course the driver differences that we are sort of seeing as well. And I really hope that Ferrari's strategy to come back in the balance races of the season doesn't rely on Red Bull running out of development budget, because that was actually Matteo Binotto's first response when he said, we've not brought single upgrade to our car, but Red Bull are just constantly throwing things. So with the budget cap, I hope they run out of money at some point. And of course, I'm sure he was joking, but I'm sure, Barcelona is when we'll see a lot of upgrades coming in.
Yeah. Barcelona is a very technical track. It's no surprise that Barcelona for 2 decades or more has been the place where you do most of your pre-season testing. And that's before we had testing restrictions and things like that. You went to Barcelona and spent the winter there if you could. Barcelona is not a great racetrack in terms of racing entertainment. If you want a drone fest, that'll be the one to watch probably. I used to go into the commentary booth for a Barcelona race with anything up to 17 pages of notes, because I knew I'd have to fill in an awful lot of gaps in the action. But equally, it's going to be an intriguing one to see how and who performs on this very technical track. The track that they came to in Miami, nobody really knew what it was going to deliver. We didn't know what the surface would deliver. We didn't know what the temperature would deliver. We didn't know what the tyre temperatures would deliver, and even fuel burn. And the shortening of practice for a lot of people due to incidents, for example, compromised some people knowing how much fuel put in the car. I reckon some of the cars were running a couple of kilos heavy just to be on the safe side, so they didn't run short of fuel. And there's little things like that, but 2 different strategies played out. Red Bull went for a low downforce, high straight line speed, and they were 20 kilometers an hour faster down the straights, even with the DRS on. Then they, even without the DRS on, rather. But they were 5 kilometers an hour slower through the corners. Ferrari went the other way. They went for downforce, quick through the corners, but even with the DRS open, they couldn't catch the Red Bull down the straight. So it was 2 different philosophies. You won't get away with doing that in Barcelona. It won't let you.
Before we go into Ferrari and Red Bull land and stuff, I have to ask you, I think I heard another Steve Slater term out here. I've normally heard of the term snooze fest. Did I just hear you call it the drone fest?
Correct. You get certain races that are a drone fest where they drone round and round for 72 laps and we wake up in time to say somebody's won.
Well, this almost was a drone fest, wasn't it? Just for a while, until we had the safety car. Oh, man.
Yeah, it was, but I tell you what, that should not reflect on the effort that was put in by the drivers there.
Yeah.
And actually, when's the last time you can actually hear a crowd roar for overtaking moves and things like that? The atmosphere at that place was just awesome.
Yeah. I mean, they've just kind of created a wonderful event per se. And I'm just wondering, right? You said it at the start, if this is what they've done for Miami, how on earth are they going to top it up for Las Vegas? That is going to be some show. But I think that's for later on. I just want to talk about Red Bull a little bit more, because the decisive moment is something I'm very keen about. Because at the start, it seemed like Red Bull, well, they were there but not completely there. Which one would you pick as the moment of the race for Max Verstappen? Was it the start per se, or the pass he made on Charles, or the fact that, in fact, Ferrari didn't quite cover off the pit stop when the safety car came? Because even that could have been an opportunity in its own.
It could have been, but I think everyone was just doing the best they could with what they had at the time. 2 things really came to mind for me, at least. I think the pivotal moment of the race probably was that first lap, because that move into turn 1, turn 2 was Verstappen at his very best. And that allowed him then to control the pace of the race. Everyone was playing catch up after that. But the other thing, that in the latter stages of the race, the one thing that jumped out at me, and it wasn't just pure speed of driving, Leclerc was giving it absolutely everything in that Ferrari. That car was on the limit so many times and beyond it occasionally. If Leclerc had been driving the Mercedes, it would have been in the wall half a dozen times. But that Ferrari was being driven beautifully. But Max managed his energy recovery systems so well. And this is the bit you don't get to see. And frankly, I think is actually really a bit stupid having it in F1, is that, you can recharge your batteries tactically at certain points in the race. You can actually be slow mid-corner. And I saw that Max do that at one point. It was actually just behind just after the safety car. He actually slowed so much in the hairpin that Leclerc actually had to really stand on the anchors to avoid him. And that was purely and simply to create an unstable situation, so Leclerc couldn't use his charging systems as well as Max. And Max was driving so intelligently. But actually, so much of that is almost invisible because we can't see what's going on with those energy recovery systems. And nor do I want to see it. I'd rather see some guys racing flat out. But then again, I prefer V12s and 6-speed manual gearboxes.
Oh boy. And post-race, it was actually revealed that Charles Leclerc did not have a drinks tube system working. So he was without a drink throughout the race. Given how physically tiring and how hot and humid it was, for the drivers and for the tires, I think that was pretty fantastic. And, I'm sure the temperatures also sort of come into play when you consider all the car characteristics that between Ferrari and Red Bull and even Mercedes for that matter.
Well, the cars are one thing, and to be perfectly honest, a 5-degree C temperature shift from one track to another will have an effect on the cars. But the drivers, you're talking 90 degrees plus in the cockpit. You're talking 70% humidity. We're talking Malaysia on a hot day. We're talking, I will leave it for you to explain where in India would be equivalent. I have actually been to, the Madras Motorsport circuit on a couple of occasions, and I know just how hot it gets in those pit lanes. And it's not just for them, it's for the pit crews as well. We saw pit lane mistakes and pit lane wheel nut seizures and things like that, which I'm sure are going to be also as part of the temperature that everybody's working in. And that it's a pretty hostile environment, a Formula One pit lane or a Formula One cockpit, particularly when the temperature is up above 90.
Yeah, and actually that's such a good point, because we saw a couple of cars having their front left pit guns fail, and the best part you mentioned was the effect on the drivers. But it's amazing how their conditioning has changed, because even after such a heavy race, they were fine, but they looked stressed out. This is probably one of the most physical races that we have so far.
Sure. Just have a thought for the pit crew here. We're in that temperature, that humidity. They're wearing fireproof overalls, 3 layers. They've got their gloves on, heat-proof gloves. They've got their helmet on to protect them against anything that goes wrong in the pit itself. Now, you go and stand in the middle of the highway in front of you and put your hand up and expect a guy to stop, because that's the speed the car's coming down the pit lane. Then when you get hold of that wheel is at the same temperature as a boiling kettle, if not more, because it's 100 and something degrees. So you've got to manhandle that, 20-kilo wheel and tyre combination, which is hotter than a boiling kettle, while you're wearing all that gear in a 90-degree pit lane. And then you've got to grab the other one that's just come out of the tyre warmers. That's only quite hot as a scalding cup of tea. And you've got to put that on with a millimetre accuracy. And do it inside 3 seconds.
Crazy how tough of a job they have. And I think you mentioned one thing, but you forgot one thing. I think no jewellery as well for them. not under all those overalls. I think that topic has been discussed far too much. But
yeah, I'm totally in favour of that. If you had a fire in a car, a steel necklace or jewellery or a metal watch is going to get really hot really quickly. Totally negates the effect of all the Nomex you're wearing, because you're going to end up with first-degree burns on your skin, and that's going to sting. But, so I'm really pleased. I can't guess, but I'm guessing Romain Grosjean wasn't wearing a lot of metal jewellery when he got out of that car at the end of his career.
Absolutely, but I just wonder, how will the watch manufacturers promote their brands then? I was actually shocked, because when Mercedes were having those watch-like gloves, I thought that, well, these are just gloves, but they actually had watches underneath as well. So that was a bit of a shocker for me when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think it was. I think the water-like gloves were a great way. If you can't promote your product sensibly, I mean, I still can't quite get over Sebastian Vettel's protest by wearing his underpants on the outside of his race suit.
Superman.
Yeah, exactly. That was my only thought. But I personally, I think it's a common sense decision. And although some of the drivers may well wish to complain about the lack of publicity for some of their sponsors, you really don't want those sort of burns that a hot racing car is going to give you if you're wearing something metal against your skin.
Well, exactly. And speaking of burns, I think it's a good time to come to Ferrari because this one must have stung. I mean, think about it. 1-2 in qualifying, starting 1-2 completely. It was just their race to lose. And they lost it. We've spoken about the track characteristics, about the car characteristics, but strategy-wise, sir, do you see that? I mean, did you see that Ferrari could do something differently per se?
Not really. They were stuck into that strategy from the moment they brought the car out in a high downforce specification. They knew they would have to defend against a low downforce. Well, they knew once they realised the specification Red Bull Racing were running, they would have to defend against a low downforce, fast in a straight line car. And in a racing situation, if that car is behind you and it's faster down the straight, guess what? You're going to get past. I think that they did, once they had committed to that strategy, they couldn't change a lot. And I think actually they did a really good job. They brought Leclerc home in second. He still leads the World Championship. Ferrari still lead the World Constructors' Championship. So it's still pretty good, and there's an awful lot of the season still to go, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But there's no doubting on the day that Max Verstappen and that Red Bull were just the best combination.
Also a part of Ferrari's strategy just seemed like they wanted to settle for the maximum points they could get. It did come out to be a bit of a surprise that they weren't trying something different. They were just following suit as they would. And maybe, of course, we are reading too much, but they realized, early on into the race that whatever it is that they throw at Red Bull, they do not have the ultimate pace to compete. And maybe that, the pace deficit was so much that it was probably better to just secure second and third and take the points home and, develop the car to fight another day.
I think there's a little bit of that in it, and I think you're correct. But what I would say is that Red Bull had brought a whole bunch of technical upgrades to the track. Ferrari elected not to. They've got other stuff that's still waiting in the wings, I suspect. Either that or they stopped developing the car, which I can't imagine would be the case. And I think, they are still in the situation. They still have the quickest cars on track for solo laps during the qualifying. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been on the... So saying, actually, probably Max would have been quicker if he hadn't made a mistake at the start of his final qualifying lap. So it is going to be like that all the way through this season. And that's what makes a good Formula One season.
Absolutely right. I mean, just... the best part about racing is you just need a simple formula. You just need one car that's faster in the corners, one that's faster in the straight, and it just makes for such a good show, whether it's bikes, whether it's cars, whatever it might be. It's just so simple. But I want to bring our attention on to Williams because Alex Albon ended up scoring points. And now at this stage, the only thing that's flashing past my mind is, well, firstly, we don't have a proper back marker, which is amazing to see that everyone can score points, including Williams, by the way. And the second thing is, well, Nicholas Latifi is actually costing the team a lot of money because if they had two, I can't say the word, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't say two competitive drivers, but you get the idea. Right? Two drivers on the same level of Albon, maybe they could have been doing this more often. So it's kind of hurting the team now, actually.
I don't think it will feel like that with inside Williams. They will feel that they've been unlucky with Latifi. Nicholas, I'm sure, feels that he's been unlucky. He's no mug. He's come through the junior formulas and proven his ability there. And of course, he's bringing quite a lot of money to the team. Alex Albon, I think the pressure's off him. This is a guy who's sat in a Red Bull. He knows where he's at. It didn't work out for him at Red Bull, but it is working out for him at Williams. And he's a clever strategic driver. Is he the best wheel-to-wheel racer in the world? Well, past experience indicates he isn't. And dare I say, it's the same with Valtteri Bottas. Put Valtteri in a good car, he drives really well. Put him into a wheel-to-wheel racing situation and it all goes a little bit wrong. So I think Alex is in a really good position to rebuild his reputation and his career. Whether he'll move on from Williams somewhere else or whether he'll be a front runner in that Williams for the next year or two, that remains to be seen. Nicholas, he has to improve. He can't afford to be the crash test dummy for the Formula One grid.
That is the best thing I've heard all day. We've been trying to be so subtle about it on the podcast, but this is the best statement I've heard about it, isn't it, Kunal?
I think so. Nicholas Latifi will probably go down the Daniel Kvyat route at some point. He will suddenly retire and nobody will miss him. And at least Kvyat had podiums and did what he did, his torpedo moves. And I mean, not a comparison between the talents of the drivers, but to me, Latifi's of course there with the money, but I think talent is certainly gone lacking. Albon has come in, he's claimed Williams to be his team, and just a statement from Latifi which sort of didn't make sense for me. So when he got out qualified by Albon again in Miami, he said, I know the better parts are on Alex's car, right? The truth is that the gap between the two of them was less than a tenth. Now, if I was Jost Capito, I'd just be very pissed that suddenly my driver's gone and said that my upgrades are worth less than a tenth of a second.
What I would say there is there's a little bit of that, and there's always a feeling of anyone who's in a team. And if you were to talk to Naren Karthikeyan, Karen Chandok, they'd all tell you there is a feeling in a team, particularly a team, shall we say, in the back five, that there is only so much development money. And do you make two of everything and then find they don't work and scrap them? No, you don't. You make one, see whether it works, and then make another one. And you've got to choose whose car you put that stuff on. So it makes good sense to actually have some bits that only go to one driver. Then if they work, the other driver can have them as well. And I can see Latifi's frustration. He must be getting, though, into the little bit of a situation where the accountants will be drawing the line of how much income he's bringing to the team and the line of how much crash damage it's cost them. And if those two lines cross, you'll end up with a meeting with Jost Capito, who doesn't offer you a cup of coffee.
I think it would be perfect to call it the break-even point, because the car is broken so much. You could probably refer it to that. Well, I know we have to speak about Miami, but this part you mentioned about upgrades just reminds me of one thing that I want to know your specific take on. Mark Webber back in the day, not bad for a number 2 driver, the British GP. Because teams often tend to do that, right? But that year, Webber had the upgrade on his car. I think it was 09 that we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And then the part was given to Vettel. Is it a similar situation but on a lower scale in a way? Because we know who's the talented driver, but in that case, it must have been so hard to choose for Red Bull.
Let's face it, Red Bull were in the position of winning races at that point. Williams aren't. Them getting a couple of championship points, that's money in the bank for them, literally. And they really could do with getting both drivers getting the cars into the points. In the Mark Webber situation, it was utterly political. The Red Bull, the German-speaking Red Bull senior management had made the decision that Vettel was the star of the future. Sebastian would turn up, shake hands with everybody in the hospitality unit, crack jokes with everybody, go into the pits, talk to all the mechanics and everything. With all respect, Mark used to turn up with a stubble on his chin. Nice guy was Mark, but he wouldn't talk to anybody unless it was going to be useful. There was a total difference, and Red Bull went 100% behind Sebastian. Sebastian knew how to work that, and that was totally the way that Red Bull operated, and Mark felt left out of it. And I think he was quite right. He's not the only person that's felt like that in a Red Bull. I can probably list you about half a dozen if I sat down to it. You think about the number of people that have been number 2 in a Red Bull and have felt disaffected. One of the great strengths of Sergio Perez, he's gone in. He hasn't threatened Max Verstappen unduly, but he has worked with the team, and the team see him as a part of the team. And, it's going to be really quite interesting to see with Pierre Gasly, because there's a lot of movement still going on in Red Bull, because Gasly's one of the Red Bull young drivers who's stagnated, frankly. Gasly, if he's not in a number 2 seat in a Red Bull next year, will feel that he's failed in that respect. But would you depose Sergio Perez for Gasly at this point? I don't think so. I think they've got the perfect number 2 driver.
You do, and a lot of a lot of people on Twitter were asking the question, why is it that Perez couldn't actually overtake Carlos Sainz? And Christian Horner's given interesting insight. The Red Bull again wasn't the most reliable car, as we heard Perez complaining about losing power, and he was convincing his engineer, saying, "What are you talking about the numbers? I know I'm not going fast on the straights." And he lost some 5 odd seconds to Carlos Sainz over a single lap. And then Horner turned around and said that there was a sensor issue on one of his cylinders and they had to manage the show. And that cost Perez 30 horsepower in his fight against Carlos Sainz. And of course, no doubt Carlos Sainz drove very well. He defended extremely well. But just adding to your point, what Checo Perez did last year against Hamilton, and now just how close he's showing he can be to Max Verstappen. He's made a full case for himself to be renewed for at least another couple of seasons. And, Pierre Gasly is going to struggle to find a competitive seat elsewhere. Maybe, Daniel Ricciardo's seat at McLaren. Again, I'm just speculating.
I think it's a bit early in the season to speculate yet. Daniel Ricciardo's still learning that car, that's for sure. But there are a couple of people that may move on at the end of the season, and Pierre Gasly would be in a good position to take advantage of that. I can't help but think that Fernando Alonso is in the last lap, if not the penultimate lap of his Formula One career. Alonso is still driving well, don't get me wrong. He was, he had an erratic race this weekend, but so did both Alpines. But there is a certain timeline by which, even Kimi Räikkönen, who would have carried on until he had walking sticks to get to the car. But there has to be a time that comes where you've just got to decide, just like me hanging up my microphone as a commentator, you have to decide that maybe it's time to let the kids in.
Well, I don't think it's the same case. Maybe not so much if you're as good as you are, sir. Again, I'm just a fanboy. You can see me smiling ear to ear throughout this episode because I just realized time to time that we're doing this with Steve Slater. So again, that's my part of praise done for today. But we have to focus on the more serious Formula One side of things. And I love that you mentioned Fernando Alonso. It's like you can read my mind because I was just about to come to him. When has he driven so erratically before? I just can't seemingly remember. And when you look at it from a grand scale of things, right, this is just not what Fernando Alonso came back to Formula One for. It's quite the opposite, actually. So I think you've kind of answered my question in a way. Will he stay beyond the season? Because it seems like it doesn't make sense from his point of view, doesn't it?
Well, we're still only not even half a dozen. We're 4 races into the season. So I'm not too worried yet for Fernando Alonso's future. He is a winner. He's never the sort of guy who would stand at the door and say, after you. He's going to push as hard as he possibly can. And you have to ask the same question as Sebastian Vettel. You've got 2 world champions there, multiple world champions, which of them is going to lose motivation? Vettel would really like to try and make that team work around him. And again, you've got another situation there with Lance Stroll. He really is that strong a driver in that car. Certainly, is he capable of working through the problems with the car? Vettel's probably better at that. Fernando Alonso, it's a team he feels at home in. You have to remember, this is although it's called Alpine on the car, it is Renault, and it's the team he won 2 world championships with back in the day. So, I think Fernando, I wouldn't be surprised to see him move on at the end of the year. He'll make a heck of a Grand Prix commentator if you can keep him under control. Sebastian Vettel, I think he's going to be an asset to Aston Martin, the brand, as well as Aston Martin, the F1 team. I don't think he'll be going anywhere for a year or 2 yet. He's still got a mountain to climb within that team. But we talked earlier about Mercedes and we talked earlier about Williams. One thing in common with some of these teams that are struggling, they're all using the Mercedes technology. And I'm just wondering if the problem lies deeper than just the Mercedes chassis, whether there is a problem with the power unit, the drivability of the power unit, that's putting them at a disadvantage to the Ferrari and the Red Bull powered cars.
That's an interesting point about, Mercedes-powered cars. And one of the reasons I was reading, and it was the great Mark Hughes who pointed this out, that McLaren, being a Mercedes customer, are not struggling as much because they are using their own gearbox, and maybe it's the whole placement at the rear and the packaging that's making a difference. But going back to the two former multiple world champions, I think Fernando Alonso had a very Sebastian Vettel-esque race. Vettel from his last couple of years at Ferrari,
come on.
I mean, I am, saying this in a lighthearted, with lighthearted spirit, but he had 2 collisions in a race. I can't remember when last did Fernando Alonso have 2 collisions. One was, on the opening lap with Lewis Hamilton, and then, of course, his issue with Pierre Gasly. And, Alonso being Alonso, he turned around and said, I apologize. It was my mistake. I was trying too hard.
Yeah.
And maybe he was overdriving that Alpine, because let's remember Esteban Ocon, who couldn't start qualifying, actually had a fantastic race to come up and finish in the points. So the difference between really driving the car and overdriving the car is probably what cost Alpine, double points, because Alonso had, I think, 2 5-second time penalties in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Alonso probably was overdriving out of frustration. I think that you can get to that sort of a situation. And in fact, actually, if we look at all the, shall we say, ex-world champions, they all had a pretty torrid race, other than Max.
Samuel, it seems you're on mute. Your mic button needs to go off. There you go. Yes.
I love
sorry,
it.
I was trying to figure out whether that was a commercial break.
No, I love it. It's been 2 years since we've been kind of pushed into this virtual world of sorts, and I still haven't forgotten to do the basic stuff right. Again, happens to the best of us. But the duffer part was with Haas and Aston Martin, to be honest with you, because it was so frustrating. Again, fun, very much fun. That battle with Magnussen and I think Lance Stroll was pretty amazing, and so was the case with Vettel and Schumacher until it lasted. Yeah. But I mean, I just can't help but think that Haas are just underperforming terribly, because they've got this amazing package, but for some reason both their drivers are not able to extract the results that they possibly can. Schumacher with the crash, Magnussen with the penalties for weaving. Is it just the heat that's getting them wild, or is there something deeper to that, sir?
I think that all of these cars are much more difficult to drive than it appears at first sight. To get the tyres into a temperature window where they work is the real challenge. And I suspect that Aston Martin, forget the fuel temperature issue that put them to this pit lane for the start for this race, they've never really been better than midfielders since this season started. They've been tugging around in the middle of the pack, getting a few lucky breaks, but quite a few unlucky ones. In the case of Haas, this is actually the first time that we don't have a Haas in the points. This was the team that was, if it hadn't been for Netflix, I don't think would have survived. The Haas team and Günther Steiner have done a fantastic job of regrouping. They didn't spend any money at all last year on their car. They ran at the back, they took the start money, and they knew they were never going to do anything. As Günther Steiner said in an interview, he says, we're the only team that's performed exactly to our expectations. We knew we'd come last, and we did. And the Haas team have done a brilliant job this year. It was unfortunate for them that in what is perceived as their home territory in America, they couldn't put on a better show for their home fans. But I still think that Haas are a top 5 material if they continue to develop the way they have been.
For everybody listening in, and if you're hearing engine sounds in the background, it is because Steve, who of course we know as the Formula One guru, is also the CEO of the Light Aircraft Association in the UK. And if my memory is correct, he's sitting at the Turveston Aerodrome in Brackley, Steve. Is that correct?
That's correct. And unfortunately, we just had a couple of aircraft take off about 400 meters from my window, which I couldn't do anything about.
Which is fantastic. Knowing your love for aviation, I'm sure you probably just at a glance could be like, that aircraft is this make, this model, this year, this engine. And at least right
even
now
the pilot.
Yes,
even better.
Yeah. But back to our love for Formula One, what we've heard you and seen you in action while growing up, and Aston Martin, their race was actually done in by the two Haas drivers. We saw Kevin Magnussen and Lance Stroll have that issue, and very strange again. And then the unexpected, Mick Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel going aggressive against each other. Now, I know that, their crash, they've been very diplomatic after it. And I know it's not going to cause any damage to their, father, son, elder brother, younger brother relationship. But it was good to just see that both of them can get aggressive with each other if it comes to that.
Well, I think actually until the moment of the accident, that was Mick Schumacher's best race he's ever had in Formula One.
Yeah,
he's clearly talented. He's no fool. He has a good racing brain. He actually put a really good overtaking manoeuvre on Vettel, and for all Vettel complaining that he was it was a dirty lunge, it wasn't. And actually, it was Vettel who turned into him. Equally, you've got to leave room for each other. And the first rule of a race is to finish. And unfortunately, Mick will have learned from that. And Sebastian's not the most aware of racers these days. We've seen this so many times. He doesn't see the manoeuvres coming. He perhaps has that world champion's mentality that no one's going to try and move on me. And unfortunately, it still happens. So I have a lot of time for Sebastian Vettel, but in that particular case, I think it was at least a 50-50. And Mick was perfectly justified when that door had been left open of having a dirty lunge for it.
Would we label them as the 8 sleep underperformers of the race then? Because with Aston Martin, there was just such a huge surge of pace. I mean, we thought that they would be completely out of it, but since their upgrades have come in, they have been able to mingle around a little bit. And when you consider the fact that Aston Martin started this race from the pit lane, can we label them as one of the underperformers of this race per se?
Oh, absolutely. From the mistake that was made in the pits where they overcooled the fuel, through to mistakes by or the incidents with their drivers that potentially were avoidable. I think absolutely the team has much better potential than that, and I think there's a few logistical problems the team probably needs to get right. You shouldn't be making fundamental errors in the pit garage.
Yeah.
We saw that in the last couple of years at Ferrari, where the mechanics all come scuttling out and somebody says, no, the big wheels go on the back, and things like that. It's I think that sometimes, and when a team is growing, and Aston Martin is a team that is growing, you have to remember this is a team that came out of the old Jordan team.
Yep.
So it's grown from one of the smallest teams on the F1 grid to being a luxury car manufacturer supported, high intensity, high visibility team. They'll get their act. They've got some good people in there. They'll get the act together. But they need to get the act together.
And well, speaking of, I just have to talk about McLaren as well eventually, because this was a bit of a torrid weekend for them. We discussed the crash, bit of a crazy one, what happened, but in general too, this was McLaren's biggest event per se, because they had so many guests coming in, so many celebrities, so many sports stars, so many people that Martin Brundle could annoy on the grid, but that's beyond the point. The point is, why just did it all go wrong for McLaren? Because it seemed like it was going fine until last week. Suddenly they come here and they hit a wall. It has to be track specific, isn't it? And that just makes it even more fun, because this midfield is a hot potato now.
It's what I was saying earlier about it's turning the cars on and turning the cars off to suit conditions, getting the temperatures up to the tyres up to temperature, getting the airflow under the car working to its optimum. And it's like what was a double bay window of opportunity last season has now narrowed to a chink in the curtains. And if you're not in that little bright spot in the curtains, you ain't going nowhere. And they were definitely in the shade this weekend. The one thing I would say is, though, I don't know whether you were able to see the interview of Zach Brown with Mario Andretti. And I thought that, because Zach is an absolute Formula One race fanatic. He drives his own historic F1 cars. He has cars like the ex-Ayrton Senna Lotus Honda Turbo, the car that gave 1,400 horsepower for qualifying on the street circuit of Adelaide. He's got all sorts of amazing cars, and he's a total enthusiast who happens now to have found himself, made himself the owner of one of the top F1 teams. But Zach was having a conversation with Mario Andretti, and I think it was Martin Brundle had said to Mario, "So would you like to drive one of these cars?" He says, "Of course I would." He says, and he was making very unsubtle hints. "Yes, I would like to. This is on my bucket list, etc., etc." And Zach Brown says, "Well, okay then. See you in Austin. We'll sort it for you." So we're going to have the sight of 82-year-old Mario Andretti driving a current Formula One car. That will be awesome because Mario won't go slow.
Wow.
That's actually, for me, was one of the highlights of all the pit lane conversations in Miami.
Andretti for FP1. Finally, there's one Andretti coming to F1.
It'll be a demo, but either way, it'll be fun.
I mean, finally, at least we'll have one Andretti in a Formula One car after all the years of waiting.
It might well be. Yes, let's not go there because that could be an announcement also at Austin.
Yeah. I actually thought there would be some sort of announcement in Miami, given Andretti's, conversations with the FIA and the likes. But another conversation that, I hope doesn't come up sometime in Austin is around Daniel Ricciardo. He's struggling. He's still taking time to learn. Somehow McLaren seem to have lost some patience. They've gravitated all towards Lando Norris. And the question has to be asked, is he a very expensive team leader turned number 2 driver? Could they do better getting an American driver, not the Andretti, the 82-year-old Andretti, of course? But if there is any light at the end of the tunnel for Daniel Ricciardo, and I must say that his weekend was compromised by McLaren largely because in qualifying his car didn't fire up in time in Q2, so he had just a 2-second margin to get over, and start his final lap. So that sort of destroyed his tire preparations. And then in the race, he was stuck in that DRS train, which ruined the race for a couple of drivers in itself. But I'd love to get your view on Daniel Ricciardo, and then maybe even on the whole DRS trains that we are seeing.
Well, the DRS trains, it's quite interesting. I mean, the DRS was making something like a 20 kilometre an hour difference in speed in Miami. So basically the DRS train is that the guy in the front of the train doesn't have a DRS that everyone else has. And I do wonder, I've never been a great fan of DRS. It looks too much to me like a PlayStation push to pass button. I would certainly prefer to have the drivers do it if they wanted really to get some good for overtaking. Just make the braking distances longer, reduce the amount of the amount of grip, better still reduce the brakes, make them brake earlier. And if you did that, you'd have longer braking zones. You do most of the overtaking in a braking zone. Sorted.
Interesting.
And even now, the front wings are still unduly complicated. It was my old co-commentator, Gary Anderson, once said, just stick a plank of wood on the front. The rest of the car has to follow the wing. If the wing's inefficient, the rest of the car will be sliding around as well, and we'll get good racing.
And then it'll be the ultimate test for the Formula One drivers in a way. Hey, that's a fun idea. Well, that's something we should dwell upon a little bit more. But
trouble is, you try and tell that to a bunch of Formula One teams that have each got 300 people working in their aerodynamics department.
What do you mean we'll have to fire 200 of them if that'll be the case in that sense? No, it's crazy. It'll be fun. It just raises the challenge more for drivers like Ricciardo in a way, because then you just got to fight the car a bit more.
Well, exactly. And actually, they've gone some other way to doing that with this current spec F1 car. It's the shorter wheelbase. It's heavier. It's got the bigger profile tyre, lower profile tyre. A lot of the things on that car are actually doing exactly that. But it would be, for me still, if everyone's ever seen a Formula Ford or even Formula Maruti race where you've got minimal downforce, you get some great driving at that. There's people going from opposite lock to opposite lock and they're still halfway down the straight.
Yeah, I mean, those races are fun to watch. I mean, that's the whole talk, right? Tougher the car, more fun it is. I just love it. Wow. And, well, before we actually go to just some of the track changes, we just want to talk more about Ricciardo and what do you reckon about him? Too early, too late? Is he still the team leader per se?
I don't know whether he's still the team leader. I think Lando Norris has actually demonstrated a superiority within that team, and it's very difficult for Daniel to come back from it. But he was the new kid on the block in the team anyway. He replaced Carlos Sainz. Look at Carlos Sainz at Ferrari. He's being relatively comfortably outpaced by Charles Leclerc, and Charles Leclerc is sort of a de facto team leader. When you're leading a world championship, the team has to listen. I don't think Daniel is at the end of his career by any stretch. Whether he will go on longer with McLaren, you have to remember he's jumped around from team to team to team a little bit, and we've seen some really talented drivers spoil their careers by doing that. And I would certainly, if I was his manager, I'd be saying, ride it out for another year. Just get your feet under this table. Make sure that you're contributing to the team and take it from there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a torrid situation for him. Nobody likes to see him in that sense. Worst yet, not even anyone in McLaren would want to see that, because it's crazy how lopsided that team is becoming. But to more positive things, to more, let's say, things that leave you on a better note, just to wrap off the track. Would you recommend any changes per se for next year? I mean, I know if you were Esteban Ocon, you'd be saying change the wall at the chicane. But what about you, sir?
Absolutely. Tech Pro barriers wouldn't take away from the racing there at all. And I think we were very lucky, both in qualifying, in practice and the race. We didn't have a car hit the barrier really hard there. I mean, it was miraculous that when Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly had that collision, how Lando somehow stayed away from the barriers on it. I mean, that was an amazing piece of luck, really, and we shouldn't be relying on luck for safety. Tech Pro barrier, for those that don't know it, is basically some shaped plastic barrels which contain a certain amount of water. When you hit them, by the water blowing out through a valve, you'll see the water go everywhere.
Yeah.
That actually controls the deflation. It's not just like a balloon so it'll burst. It actually controls the deflation, and they're very, very sophisticated. It was actually Singapore was the very first track to put Tech Pro barriers in. And that was back in, 2010, 2009? And those Tech Pro barriers really they saved lives in motorcycle racing, and I'm pretty sure they saved lives in other forms of motor racing as well. And these days, while it's all very heroic and everything, there's really no real need to cream a car down a concrete barrier. There are better alternatives available, as they'd say.
And I think the bigger challenge was the tarmac in itself. I don't think they anticipated what the heat and the grip of the Formula One cars would actually do to things. Because again, just to quote Daniel Ricciardo, he said that Formula One drivers seemed very amateur in their lines through turn 17, because he said there was such little grip out there that they had no clue what they were doing. And that's, we saw so many drivers take different lines. In fact, Valtteri Bottas himself, he said, I braked a fraction too late, too little, and then almost ended up nudging the ball. So hopefully that's something that they will keep in mind. But the one thing I wish they don't change, Steve, is what Yuki Tsunoda called as the Formula E sector. Right, which was the final sector, which was everything is slow and twisted. And of course, Max Verstappen explained why he thinks that they should change that sector. He said this generation of cars are too long, too wide, and too heavy for such slow speed Mickey Mouse stuff, as I would call it while growing up racing. But personally speaking, I just loved it. I'm saying a Formula One car should be tested across all sorts of corners, including all the Formula E stuff, because hey, the Formula E cars are sometimes being driven on Formula One circuits anyway.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, and bear in mind, I've seen far worse street circuits in America. I remember going to St. Petersburg in Florida for an IndyCar race, and I stood on the tracks, or walking along the track before racing started, thinking, well, this is a nice wide pit lane. And then I realised it was the track.
It's actually an airfield. It's just an airfield.
St. Petersburg, isn't it?
No, I'm the front stretch of it.
Yeah.
No?
Oh, yeah. It's a runway or taxiway.
Yeah.
But I mean, the old Sebring airfield in Florida, of course, is just an airfield. That's it. You raced around bollards and avoided the C-130s. And excuse the aeroplane noises above me. We had race cars testing on the runway the other week, so this is back to its normal use. But the track surface, actually, the teams will complain about it because it's difficult to get it to work. But actually, we need different track surfaces. And if you think that track surface is dodgy, you try Monaco. But you have to remember the Formula One cars generate so much suction underneath them that if you run them on a street circuit, you have to weld the manhole covers down. We've seen Formula One cars actually suck up a 200-pound iron manhole cover from the tarmac. So you've actually got to bolt them into place and then weld them. So street circuits are always going to be a challenge. This really was a street circuit. It was a circuit round a parking lot, effectively.
Steve, just at the end of the conversation, you brought up something you mentioned in the broadcasts while I was growing up about the manhole covers being welded and just the amount of downforce the cars would generate. And I kid you not, every single person who I tried to convert into becoming a Formula One fan, I would state exactly this fact. Of course, as though I was the one who found out the fact. So it brings back so many memories when you speak of all the manhole covers. And thank you so much for doing that.
It's all right. I think it's welded in my mind because I think I had to talk, myself and Steve Dawson had to talk for something like 2 hours while the racing was suspended while they welded the manhole covers up in Montreal.
Well, imagine what it'll be like in Monaco, where we do have manhole covers. I hope they do them well, because John Effect cars, but it's crazy to think that what will exactly happen, right?
Yeah, well, Monaco has a long history, of course, of preparing for the race. And I think it was Eddie Irvine once said that track really is, it shouldn't be a Formula One cars. He says it's like riding your mountain bike around your living room. I mean, I always remember a great statistic that my friends at the Singapore Grand Prix brought out, which was the Anderson Bridge, the really narrow bridge in Singapore.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. That's wider than the parts of the Monaco Grand Prix circuit.
You're kidding me?
No.
Wow.
So that's most of the Monaco Grand Prix circuit's about the same width as the Anderson Bridge.
But again, you just don't need that wide of a circuit, because Formula E just went there this past weekend and just made everyone realize that it's probably the cars, not the track, that's the major difference. But hey, that's just what it is, right? I mean, that's just a long run thing for F1, whether they decide to go back to the better, more agile, nimble cars with V10s. I know I'm a bit biased in that case. But as we wrap off this episode, sir, I just have to ask you about your bold predictions for the end of the year. From what we've seen so far, what would be one that you are going to make?
My heart says I'd love to see Ferrari at the top of the podium, perhaps at very least at Monza. In leading the World Championship at Monza and the Tifosi going crazy. My head says that with Max and Red Bull as they are at the moment, don't count against a 2-times world champion.
I'll have a bold prediction in George Russell actually winning at least a couple of races before the end of the season. I think Mercedes is going to make the rocket ship technology work, and they're going to bounce back. So maybe Hamilton will win, but I think there'll be more joy in watching Russell take a couple of wins, this season, Somal. And Somal, what would yours be?
Oh, I better be ready with one, huh? I better be ready with one. I have been stumped here, quite clearly. Okay, let me go for this. I think Sergio Perez is going to win no races this year. I just get a feeling. I don't think they will let him. So there's mine. But folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode, because I certainly did. I mean, sitting right here, as I mentioned in the middle, I just constantly had to realize that, well, we are doing this with you, sir, with Mr. Steve Slater. So it's great having you on, sir. And to everyone who's listened and everyone who's watched till this point, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had a good time. And you know what to do, right? You know all the good stuff. You've been on the internet for around 10 years now. Leave a like, share, subscribe, give a good rating, all that other stuff. But once again, sir, thank you for being a part of this episode. So great to have you on. And I just wish we can do this more often.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you. And the old stump Steve is still working quite nicely. And if anyone has any questions you want to ask, let's try and get them done in the next podcast or in a future podcast. As you both know, my work around aviation means I have to attend a lot of flying events and things like that through the summer. So I'm sometimes a bit like the rest of you. I'm sitting awake late at night watching it on the TV with a beer can in my hand. But I have sympathy with me. I'll be more than happy when I can to be able to join you for another podcast.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Do that. Awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. See you and have a good week. Bye-bye.